We are Gen Xers, and we're Catholic. Members of the Catholic Worker Movement, and as Anne said, we come from the southwest corner of the state, just a few miles from both the Illinois and Iowa borders. We are also in Ho-Chunk territory, and we are in a place that probably several of you know as the driftless region, the unglaciated region, the hilly, what we think of as the prettiest part of the state. But this is a lovely area as well. But that's an area that the Ho-Chunk, who have been living in this region for thousands of years, at least 13,000 years, and likely much, much longer, since time immemorial. The Ho-Chunk refer to our region as the refuge, because that is where they survived the last ice age. So we are from an ancient, sacred landscape, as indeed this place is as well. So we are going to talk about what Brenna and I are really, really passionate about. And this is about intersecting indigenous history, indigenous spirituality, with our white settler ways and our Christian tradition. And what we're going to do is I'm going to talk for several minutes, and Brenna's going to talk a little bit about an action that she did, and then I'm going to end by talking about creating a new story here. As many of you know, in 2015, Pope Francis came out with an encyclical called Laudato Si. Us as Catholics, we don't have a whole lot to be proud of, but Pope Francis's Laudato Si is one of those things that we really hang our hat on. And it's good to know that our Lutheran kin here are also into Laudato Si, which is in a letter addressed from Pope Francis to the entire planet. And right in the midst of that letter, Pope Francis is talking about how do we determine land and our relationship with land, with the creation. And right in the midst of Pope Francis's letter, he writes, "It is essential to show special care for indigenous communities and their cultural traditions. They are not merely one minority among others, but indigenous peoples should be the principal dialogue partners. When they remain on their land, they themselves care for it best. Indigenous peoples are not one minority among others, but should be our principal dialogue partners." This is a very profound statement for Pope Francis as we think about the future of our planet together and engaging in dialogue. So Brenna and I have made small attempts. All of what we're going to be talking about, all our efforts are very, very small in the midst of a huge ecological crisis. But we've tried to listen to indigenous voices. We've tried to engage in reading, listening, showing up, and what we're going to be talking about is the fruit of what we've been hearing. Tinker is an Osage theologian out in Denver. Very, very important theologian. I believe he's at a Lutheran school. He's not Christian. He is traditional Osage, and in his book, American Indian Liberation, which is a tremendously important book, he writes these words that have been haunting me for years now. Tinker writes, "Indian peoples have experienced and continue to experience endless oppression. And we certainly suspect that the oppression we have experienced is intimately linked with the way the immigrants pray and how they understand creation and their relationship to creation and the Creator. Whether it is the stories settlers tell or the theologies they develop to interpret those stories, something appears wrong to Indian people." Tinker here is saying, as people from Europe came across the ocean to this land, to this continent, and engaged in colonization, in genocide, in dispossession, what were those stories that were driving those people to do that? Something is wrong with those stories that would enable these Euro-Americans to engage in genocide. And so I feel like Tinker here is challenging us to reinterpret these sacred stories, to re-understand our faith. Many of you are perhaps familiar with Robin Wall Kimmerer, the great Potawatomi scientist and writer. Her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, is one of the most important books published in the last few years in my mind. And at the beginning of her book, she says, we need a restoration. We need healing. And before we can have restoration, we need to engage in restoration. Restoration. We need to look at the stories. So I think what she's doing is kind of adding a layer on to Tinker's idea that there's something wrong with the stories. And so for me, that has been an invitation to re-look at our stories of faith, our stories of who we are. And that is the foundation for our restoration work, our repair work. I often hear indigenous people, when they begin speaking, talk about their origin story. A friend of ours, Michi Ken, lives in Milwaukee. I'll talk a little bit about him later. He's an Anishinaabe elder. We invited him to come to our farm. And he said, I want to begin by telling our origin story, which can take up to 2 weeks, but I won't do that. He did it in about 20 minutes. But the origin stories matter because they tell us who we are, what we're doing here, and we have our own origin story. An origin story that sometimes has gotten tied up in colonization and violent oppression. But I think it's important to go back and reread these stories. Genesis 2, there's 2 creation stories. We could spend the whole hour on this, but I won't. Genesis 2 is the older of the 2 stories, and it's very earthy. In the day that God made the earth and the heavens, God formed Adam from the Adamah and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and Adam became a living being. Out of the Adamah, God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. Out of the Adamah, God had formed every animal of the field and every bird of the air. And Adam is translated as soil, as earth, as humus. And we miss that connection in English, but you see it so clearly in Hebrew, that the earth creature was formed out of the earth. The humus being was formed out of the humus. The soil creature was formed out of the soil. We are of the earth. We are of the ground. That's our origin story. And not only are we formed out of the earth, but all animals and birds, trees, there's this intimate solidarity that you can catch in Hebrew, this linguistic connection between us and the rest of creation. I don't like the word the environment because it suggests that the natural world is somewhere out there beyond us. We are part and parcel. We are embedded within the life of creation. It's important that we recognize and understand that the Hebrews and the Israelites understood the living world as indeed living. In our white Western capitalist world, we are taught that the world around us is not alive to much extent, doesn't have animacy, isn't animate. But we can see throughout scriptures that the writers understood the living world, the natural world, to be fully alive. Psalm 65, the valleys shout and sing together for joy. Psalm 96, all the trees of the forest sing for joy before the Creator. Or 2 Psalms later, let the floods clap their hands, let the hills sing together for joy. The earth is alive, animate, participating. In the prophet Isaiah, chapter 14, wonderful, powerful chapter of scriptures. In Isaiah 14, God says to the people, "You will take up this taunt song against the king of Babylon," as they're suffering under the king of Babylon, longing for the oppression to end. How the oppressor has ceased, how his insolence has ceased. The whole earth is at rest and quiet. They break forth into singing. The cypresses exult over you. The cedars of Lebanon saying, "Since you were laid low, no one comes to cut us down." This is an amazing passage of Scripture. Isaiah is an ecological prophet, understanding deforestation as a blasphemy against God. Isaiah hears the cedars of Lebanon, the majestic, huge, ancient trees that had been consistently deforested through empire. He hears the very cedars singing out, "Since you were laid low, no one comes to cut us down." A marvelous use of words there. In our resistance to empire and oppression, even the trees are on our side. Jesus, I was thinking about this during the baptism this morning. Who shows up during Jesus' baptism? Luke 3, "Now when all the people were baptized, and when Jesus also had been baptized and was praying, the heaven was opened, and the Holy Spirit descended upon him in bodily form like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, 'You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased.'" The Spirit here takes on the form of a bird. Theologian Mark Wallace talks about we often think about as Jesus as the incarnating or the infleshing of God. Well, here is the enfeatherment of the Spirit. They understood that the divine and the natural world could coexist, that the life of the land was fully alive. And all of this is in resistance to colonialism. The process of colonization set out to mute the natural world. Amitav Ghosh writes, "Colonialism is a process of subjugating and reducing to muteness an entire universe of beings that was once thought of as having agency and the power to communicate. Only once we imagine the world as dead could we dedicate ourselves to making it so. Only once we imagine the world as dead could we dedicate ourselves to making it so." That's the colonization project that all of us have suffered under. The genocide has been animated by the logic of Western capitalism, which sees the world as being dead and a resource for us to just manage and manipulate. So to see these stories, imagine if the settlers who came across the Atlantic Ocean understood ourselves as being connected with the land intimately, fundamentally, our origin. Imagine if they understood that the natural world can communicate, is alive, full of the life force. How could those encounters, that collision, have turned into an encounter? And so these are the stories that begin, I think, to animate how we need and can create a new story on this land. And before I turn it over to Brenna, I want to show two more slides here. Many of you are probably familiar with the quip WWJD. What would Jesus do? Jennifer Harvey is a theologian down in Des Moines, Iowa, who says, "Those of us who are white, those of us who are part of the first world, those of us who are come from the powerful classes, that like people like me, from secure spots, we need to be asking ourselves not WWJD, we should be asking ourselves, what would Zacchaeus do? Zacchaeus being the tax collector in Luke chapter 19, who encounters Jesus and he says, I am going to give away half of my things and I am going to repay fourfold what I have extorted from people. And so she says, this is the model for repair. Zacchaeus. And when Zacchaeus makes this declaration of this profound radical action, what is Jesus' response? Today, salvation is found in this house. Zacchaeus doesn't change what he believes. He doesn't take on some new faith statement. He makes an act of repair, and Jesus says, that's salvation. Pope Francis very intentionally took on the name Francis to hearken back to the great Saint Francis, the medieval saint, who, when he was young and he was going through his conversion, he heard a voice, Christ coming through the cross. Repair my house. Which Francis took literally and began repairing a church that had fallen into ruins. Only after time did Francis realize, no, there's so much more to repair here in the church and in the world. And so Francis has a resonance with the indigenous spirituality that I hear about it, understanding the world and the life of creation as relatives, as kin. Francis talks about brother sun, sister moon, brother wind, sister water, an intimate sense of relationship with the rest of creation. Francis was all about healing our rift with the cosmos, with the world. So Zacchaeus and Francis, we could go on, but those are two models of, these are folks who are animated by the Spirit to engage in repair, because there's been so much broken. And we all know after 500 plus years of colonization on the land is broken, relationships are broken. And these two point us towards a way of healing. Brenna's now going to share a little bit about a very small act of resistance and repair that she engaged in.
Thanks, Eric. Anne had asked me to share with you all an action that I took with some fellow Catholic workers in this spirit of repair and trying to understand ourselves as Christians to be one with creation, and also our role as descendants of settlers and immigrants and colonialists. How do we act in support of indigenous-led resistance to such colonization and believing the world to be dead? I was really grateful, Pastor Joanne, that you shared this story this morning about indigenous voices in California with trying to stop the dams so that the salmon could swim through. And I've been really grateful all over the nation for indigenous leadership for really the last 500 years, trying to stop horrible projects of extraction and destruction from taking place, not only on their land, but on all land. In February, I'll get to it in a minute, but in February of 2019, I acted with 3 other Catholic workers and a team of folks to help shut down the tar sands, or at least for a few hours, a tar sands pipeline that was traveling through northern Minnesota, and that was in support of Ojibwe women-led resistance against this new pipeline coming through their land. So just a little background on how that action came about. In Catholic workers in the Midwest, it's been a tradition that each year we gather for a weekend at a different Catholic worker community. Several of us from all over the Midwest will join. There's actually one probably coming up here in the spring in Madison, to join a community who is actively engaging in some sort of direct action, working for justice. And then Catholic workers from all over the Midwest gather for a faith and resistance retreat to learn about the issue and to help support that resistance against the injustice. So in April of 2018, Michelle Nar-Obed and Greg Obed from the Duluth Catholic Worker Hildegard House, who had been working, invited the Catholic workers to come and help learn about what's happening with the proposed route of Line 3, a new tar sands oil pipeline proposed by Enbridge Energy, a Canadian corporation, to come and help resist against that. Greg and Michelle had learned about the action because of a lot of their work in Duluth with Native leadership, particularly women Native leadership, who were concerned about a number of things. One of primary being what would happen to the land, but also what would happen to their women and girls who, when such projects are proposed and acted on, often experience disproportionately sexual trafficking and often go missing and murdered. So a lot of Native women and others in the Duluth community were very concerned that if this pipeline project went through, that the instances of sexual trafficking would go way up and some of their relatives, daughters, wives, loved ones would be harmed. And Hildegard House was set up to be a haven for people who had experienced trafficking, where they could rest and recuperate. And so on working with around that issue, Michelle and Greg learned about this proposal for Line 3, which was proposed to, this was the proposed route, and unfortunately, I'll let you know the end. It has been since built. Our actions and many actions that have been taken against it have not yet stopped it, hopefully one day. But here's a map that they proposed. You can see that the line in some places actually travels through federally recognized like Ojibwe reservations, but also that entire green area is part of treaty rights when the Ojibwe signed treaties with the United States to say, yes, you can use this land. They said, but, and we will officially have our sovereign nations on these reservations, but we retain the right to hunt, fish, and gather on this other land. So where the rest of the green is, that's still their land, and they still have the right to hunt, fish, and gather wild medicines, berries, like sage, tobacco, all sorts of things that are sacred to them and important for their life, and wild rice. And this line is extremely detrimental to all of those things. Here's an image of some resistance, the right to rice and gather wild rice. Just a little background about Enbridge and the tar sands pipeline. Tar sands is one of the dirtiest forms of fossil fuel that you can find. I won't maybe go into all the details about tar sands oil, but here's an image of tar sands fields in Alberta, Canada. And resistance to this pipeline and lots of pipelines around the continent are led primarily, or in many cases, by indigenous nations who are going to be impacted disproportionately by these pipelines. So Michelle and Greg kind of put out the word and said to other people who were resisting indigenous-led leadership movements, would it be helpful if some Catholic workers came up and took a stand as well? And they said, sure, go for it, that would be great. So in April of 2018, a number of us, I think there were about 75 of us, who occupied a pipe yard. This is where Enbridge had stored their pipes illegally. They had not gotten permission, so we wanted to draw attention to the fact that they were storing, it was like a several acre yard full of these huge pipes, but it was outside the city, so a lot of people didn't know about it. So we drew attention to the fact that they were breaking the law. They unfortunately just got a slap on the wrist. But we broke into this pipe yard and occupied it for the day. Oddly enough, or maybe not so oddly, in rural Minnesota, a whole lot of us, everyone who occupied the yard was white, and we did not get arrested. A lot of the indigenous resistance was facing some brutal oppression to their resistance. We thought we might at least get cited or something, and we didn't. That was a real lesson for me in the difference of how different resistance depending on what race you are or how you're viewed by dominant culture, how you're treated. This is an image of Vanessa Gray. So Vanessa Gray is a First Nations woman who, I believe in 2014 or 2015, took an action with two actions actually, against a pipeline that was going through her area. And they broke into a tar sands shut-off valve site, a site where, like, in case of an emergency, you could go in and literally turn the wheel. So she was the first person who we know of who had this idea of being like a valve turner. Like, let's just go in and shut this thing down by ourselves. So she was our inspiration. So after April, when this action, we took this action, 94% of Minnesotans who came out and testified at these Public Utility Commission hearings said, no, we don't want this pipeline. All the legal things had been totally jumped through all the hoops, all the T's crossed and I's dotted, and still the 5-member Public Utilities Commission said, yep, Enbridge, you get everything you want and you can just totally build your line. So we thought we need to step this up a notch, so inspired by Vanessa Gray, and then also by 5 people in the US. This is an image taken of, I think their names are Emily and Annette in northern Minnesota, who did a valve turning in 2016, who went in and shut off lines. There were 4 different sites, 5 different people, 4 different sites around the United States on the same line. In 2016, a group of us formed. We did a lot of prayer, rooted in some of the ways that Eric was talking about prayer. We spent a lot of time gathering with one another. Michelle's there in the purple, Greg's behind her in the plaid. You can see me and Eric and some other friends. We spent much time in prayer, retreat, and action planning together. And the morning of February, we maybe hadn't been sleeping too much at that point, but the morning of February 4th, 2019, we set out to a site in Blackberry, Minnesota, which we had scoped out beforehand, and we brought this sign with us, which was from right before then a report had come out by the UN saying we had like 12 more years before things really started to snowball and escalate out of control. And the UN report said the time is now for unprecedented and urgent action. So we brought this sign with us. We have the construction hats on because we thought would be less conspicuous going into the valve site. Because of the 2 other actions that had happened before us, Enbridge had gotten wise and no longer had the steering wheels to shut down valves. So we brought tools with us to shut it down ourselves if need be. Our intention the whole time was to call Enbridge in advance, once we got inside the yard, to call Enbridge and say, we are inside your yard. We are prepared to turn off this emergency valve to shut down the flow of tar sands through the ground. We would prefer if you do it remotely and electronically, but if you don't, then we're prepared to do it. And we were pretty sure, as they actually had in the other 2 cases, that they would do it, and they did. They shut down the tar sands oil. We're not sure for how long, but we're hoping for a long time that day. That was one action, but again, the resistance against Line 3 was very much Indigenous-led. People from all over Minnesota came up to resist. There were multiple camps in northern Minnesota in 2020 and 2021. Here's a march from that time. There were really lots of creative resistance. This took place on solstice, I think, of 2020. So I think reindeer, as I understand, in some European traditions, I think this may be from Norway, reindeer are like a symbol of the solstice. And so some really great arts people in Minnesota made these costumes, and you can read on the backs. The costumes say, honor, beloved, earth, protect, Nibi, which is the Ojibwe word for water, Mitig, which I forget, I think it might be, Manuman is wild rice, To stand in front of, maybe you can see in the back there, the construction and police vehicles, where this is at the site where the Line 3 was slated to dig under the Mississippi River, which it ended up doing twice. So this Line 3 carrying tar sands oil is now traveling. It's crossing 211 waterways, including going under the Mississippi River twice. So if there's a leak, we're in trouble. So this was at that site, and on the solstice, there was hundreds of us, but including this group facing the military, or sorry, not the military, but it was like the military sometimes, the police and construction vehicles, to say that we're all here, including all of these creatures and beings saying no to this pipeline. One of the themes of the ongoing resistance, led by mostly really brave Indigenous women, Ojibwe women particularly, was to honor the treaties. Remember that map I showed you at the beginning? The treaty says, again, Ojibwe people, for each nation where a reservation was created, all of the rest of that land, they have the right to hunt, fish, gather wild rice, gather their medicines. A lot of those medicines were torn up and destroyed because lots of trees were leveled for this pipeline. I believe at least 2 wild rice beds were just drained. Billions of gallons of water was used for this project, and they had to drain wild rice beds and drain lakes. And if we actually uphold and honor the original agreements that were signed, the ones that were signed in actual good faith, which aren't many, then it would be a way to respect people, but it would also be a better way to respect the land. I think Eric's on this note. Eric's going to talk a little bit about nuns and nuns.
So in addition to Brenna's action, we're going to take the next 20 minutes or so to just talk about practices of repair and practices that are helping create a new story on this land. And these are just small things that we're involved in or know about. As Anne mentioned, we've been involved with the Nuns and Nuns Land Justice Project. Our community farm was actually tremendously financially supported by Catholic sisters in the Dubuque area. So we've had relationships with sisters and have been thinking about what's the future of these places. The average ages are in the 80s. They have these huge amounts of property, of land, and they're passionate about justice. And Catholic sisters aren't just facing it. All churches are looking at, as our numbers are dwindling, what is the future of the church? What is the future of our lands, our properties? And so Nuns and Nuns started about 5 or 6 years ago, bringing together millennials and older sisters. And out of those conversations, it's clear that sisters need help in discerning and intersecting their conversations about the future of their land with racial justice, with reparations, with his legacies of indigenous dispossession. So we're offering a number of retreats, trainings, webinars for sisters and for anyone who can join in around these conversations about healing land, creating a new story on sacred lands. Land justice, we're using that phrase, which protecting land from extraction, regenerating land's health, and expanding land equity to Black, Indigenous, and other dispossessed communities. So this is what we're moving towards, and we don't know. It feels like we're scattering seeds at this point, trying to lay a foundation for something new. Out in Long Island, the Shinnecock Nation, as they've been engaged in various justice efforts. The Sisters of St. Joseph there have been showing up in support and solidarity for the Shinnecock Indigenous community there. Very small community, very poor, right next to the Hamptons. Billionaires with poor septic systems as their septic fields are leaking into the ocean right there. And the Shinnecock Nation said, we don't have land access, but you, Sisters of St. Joseph, do. You have oceanfront property. Can we start a women-led indigenous collective raising kelp? And kelp, like we feed kelp to our cow, kelp is used for innumerable different ways. And so they're raising kelp on the ocean there, and raising kelp sinks carbon, cleanses the waters. So here are these indigenous women who are healing the waters, who are healing the lands. And the sisters who have this access, they have a retreat center there, they're aging. This is a perfect fit. So, and Anne's going to be talking more about this very soon. Should I just...
Sure, I can. Another attempt at repair that I've been involved with, this is the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. This is a group that's been around for over 10 years. It's a Native-led group that's been calling for truth and accountability, and truth and healing around the United States. I think many of you probably have heard about the residential schools in Canada through the news a couple years ago, when many children's graves were, unidentified graves were found at multiple schools, were uncovered. Native communities always knew that they were there and have been calling on non-Native communities to do their work and look into that. But those boarding schools started here in the United States. It was a US policy that spread to Canada, and we had many more schools here in the United States than were in Canada. And so that history is here too. It's just been much more kept undercover. So this group, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, goes by NABS for short. And they, a number of years ago, started putting out the call to churches who helped run these schools. About half of them were run by the US government, and the other half were run by most Christian denominations, definitely Lutherans, definitely Catholics. Put out a call for churches to do their own research into what schools they ran, what dramatic impact these schools had, to find the records and make sure they're consulting with those tribal communities who were impacted by the schools, to ask what would they like done with those records, and to figure out a way, along with the tribal nations impacted, if they want to even talk about it, and with NABS, to start taking steps forward to make amends. So I helped to start a grassroots coalition of Catholics who are working to find and locate where these records are, at least for the Catholic Church, and find out what schools we actually did run, which was at minimum 84, and I think it's actually quite a lot more than that for Catholics. The Department of Interior has identified at least 406 schools nationwide, many of which were run by Christian denominations. So we're trying to take steps toward at least being accountable to what we did. Unfortunately, the Catholic Church at large, the institution, is still not taking too many steps, but we're trying at the grassroots level to make that happen.
So we're just offering these layers of repair, and as Anne indicated, we live on 25 acres of land. We have drafted a vision statement for our small community on the land, and we have quoted Linda Hogan, a great Chickasaw writer, who writes, "A change is required of us, a healing of the betrayed trust between humans and earth. Caretaking is the utmost spiritual and physical responsibility of our time." A change is required of us, a healing of the betrayed trust. And so our work, as we're involved in Nuns and Nuns, as we're involved in boarding school healing, our day-to-day work is about healing that relationship with land. Here's a picture of the mosaic when you come in to the farm, St. Isidore Catholic Worker Farm, named after the patron saint of farmers. There we have gardens on the right. We have extensive vegetable gardens. We are engaging in no-till gardening as a way to regenerate and sink carbon into the soil. The soil, as many scientists say, will save us. So much about what we're doing is about healing soil, which gives nutritious food, which sinks carbon, which holds moisture in the ground. And so we're trying to repair and regenerate and reciprocate there on the left. So the land that we live on, the land that is likely here pre-colonization, would have been oak savanna. So extensive tallgrass prairies with abundant flowers, deeply rooted natural prairies with massive oaks dotted here and there. With colonization, people were impacted as well as the land. And so what we're trying to do in small part is healing the land. We are returning oaks to the land. It is probably the most exciting thing that I'm part of on the land. Doug Tallamy, who's a great naturalist, who says if you can do one thing only on your land, whether it's your backyard, whatever it is, plant an oak. Not all trees are equal. The oak, it's no coincidence that the oak was the predominant tree in this region. Hundreds of insects and different creatures rely on the oak tree. On our drive up this morning, I was just so happy seeing the oaks along the highway. There's hundreds more creatures than any other tree in this region, and that's true for 85% of our counties. If you want to draw life, Doug Tallamy says, plant an oak tree, tend your oak trees. And so there's a sense in which planting oaks is decolonizing the land. It's uprooting that colonization. On the right, this was just a few weeks ago, also one of the most exciting things for me is returning fire to the land. Now, the Ho-Chunk stewarded thousands of acres of land before colonization. And they did that. Their primary tool of doing that was the use of fire and clearing land, and oaks love fire. If you notice their leaves as they lay on the land, they want to be burned up because they're so hard that they can withstand the fire. And the fire returns nutrients to the land, clears out weeds, and the tallgrass prairie thrive on fire. Their deep roots aren't impacted by the fire. So these are ways that we're living very small ways, regenerating land. And Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, she talks about we need to be rooted in gratitude for the land, but we need to take a step beyond gratitude and think about reciprocity. What are we actually returning to the land? We're not just always accepting. We're in a relationship. And in a relationship, you need to reciprocate. And so us returning fire, us returning oaks to the land is our small act of reciprocity, of repairing, of regenerating the land. Animals with the land and respect for animals and creation. And there we Flora, the cow, Peter and Brenna milk Flora each day, and just ways of drawing sustenance with the land. Rotational grazing is another way of building up soil. And so we use all of her manure from the wintertime, get it on our gardens, keeping life in a circle. There's no waste, trying to always keep life in the circle. So we have delicious eggs. We turn all of our food scraps to the chickens. Our compost pile is right next to the chicken coop, so they jump in and eat whatever they want, and whenever they don't, returns to the land. And as Pope Francis says in Laudato Si, an integral ecology is made up of simple daily gestures which break with the logic of violence, exploitation, and selfishness. This is just simple daily gestures. That's part of this ongoing ecological conversion. And what we're doing on 25 acres is so small, but we need dozens more projects like it, hundreds, thousands. We also do education and open our place up for visitors to come and learn. And this is our friend Michigan here on the left. This past June, we did a 6-day workshop offered on the basis of the gift economy to anyone who wanted to come. About 25 folks joined us for a week, and the theme was around undoing colonization, decolonial action, our spirituality in the land. And so I asked Michiken here, who's Anishinaabe, could you come in and give a talk to open up our gathering? And he said, I want to build a sweat lodge. So we spent all day, and we got out of the sweat lodge about midnight that night, and that was where he started by sitting down and telling the origin story of his people, and said this could take up to 2 weeks. But this ties into cultural appropriation. This is something we never would have built on our land without Native leadership. We'll never use that lodge unless we are explicitly, as non-Native folks, invited into that. So that was a really important way, an important encounter. He just so generously and compassionately talked about their spirituality, invited us into the lodge as an act of prayer. And it was a tremendous way to start our gathering together. And we continue to collaborate with him. Recently, a couple weeks ago, we were invited to Sheboygan, Wisconsin, where a world-class golf course is being proposed on a native sacred site in a very important ecosystem. And Michiken and I and Brenna led folks in song and prayer on the land, because we understand that what's going to help us is if we understand the land as being sacred, as not just protests, but actually going deeper and opening a way to sacred land. So we're grateful for that collaboration with him. You all, as ELCA folks, just passed a really interesting resolution that I think is really important, and I'll be curious how it plays out. This is what someone just shared with me a few weeks ago. This was passed, I don't know what the assembly's name was, but this is, what's that?
I was there.
The actual resolution to repudiate the doctrine of discovery was actually passed in 2021. I believe that was 2021 at the Churchwide Assembly in New Orleans. That was the beginning of this work that's on the table. And like I said, I'm the president of American Indian Alaska Native Lutheran Association, and we put this together for all of our congregations. And as leaders in the ELCA, we take this out as educational pieces. So I was really glad to see it on the table.
Yeah, let me just take a couple of moments to read this. To encourage all ELCA members, congregations, synods, ministries, colleges, campus ministries, seminaries, camps, associated organizations, and partners to support creative programs of restorative justice in partnership with Indigenous people, including but not limited to whenever considering a transfer or sale of real property, including returning land and any structures built on it after satisfying any financial obligations to the appropriate Native nations, and when direct return is not feasible or not desired by the Indigenous people, to return the proceeds from the sale of the land to the ELCA Native American Ministry Fund or other local Indigenous-led ministries or organizations. This is really powerful stuff, so thank you so much for your work on it.
And we do have ELCA churches that are returning funds and land.
There are ELCA churches returning funds and land, and this is that call. This is really, really exciting, and want to commend you all and thank you for your leadership on that, Pastor. Just down the road here, St. Dunstan's Episcopal Church, perhaps some of you heard about their recent move. This is, I believe, Pastor Miranda and Bill Quackenbush from the Ho-Chunk Nation. Miranda said, this is something we owe. The St. Dunstan's Madison Churches offers a voluntary tax to the Indigenous nations whose land they are on. They offered, I think it was $4,000 or so to Wisconsin nations for their repatriation work. And so I actually just talked to her a few days ago, and she said, this is just something we put in our line item in our budget. We are on Ho-Chunk land, and this has been an inspiration for us. Whenever we're thinking about making any donations, we're thinking, how can we support Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous resurgence, because the climate crisis that we're facing, if we have Indigenous leadership, if we have Indigenous folks having access to land, then we're going to be in a much, much better shape here. And this is a last slide here as thinking about creating a new story here. And the Ho-Chunk are experiencing a resurgence of sorts. And the Ho-Chunk were continually removed by the U.S. government, many times from Wisconsin, sending them out west, and they kept coming back. And eventually, they just started buying up land. They don't have a reservation here in Wisconsin. The Ho-Chunk are the people of the original voice, or the people of the sacred language. And we are very much in the heart of Ho-Chunk territory here. Two stories to tell. The one on the bottom is a picture of the former Army ammunition plant that's not too far away from here towards Baraboo. Now, this is a fascinating dynamic because the government in the 1940s removed white settler farmers from the land there to create a giant, massive Army ammunition plant. After the wars were done, the land just sat. And so after a group working for years around what is the future of this land, what's going to happen, 1,500 acres was returned to the Ho-Chunk. In the only case in U.S. history that I know of where the U.S. military directly returned land to an indigenous nation, 1,500 acres. Brenna and I had a chance to get a tour out there a few years ago, and they are restoring that land to tallgrass prairie and oak savanna and really healing the land. And it's just an amazing story. Above that, you can see Bill Quackenbush overlooking Black Hawk Rock, and we were part of this group that he led an amazing tour through Kickapoo Valley Reserve. Another incident where the government said, we are going to build a dam here, and we are going to remove all of the white settler farmers from the land here. And they removed all of them, and then decided, actually, we're not going to build a dam here. Sorry, we're going to just create a park. And so in recent years, that land has now been co-managed by the Ho-Chunk Nation. So these new stories are being created on the lands in this region that give me a lot of hope. There's so much to overcome in the history of colonization and oppression, but there's so many beautiful things that all over this continent, what many indigenous peoples call Turtle Island, there is a constellation of stories of repair and resurgence and reciprocity. And so we're grateful to be here among you. Thank you.
This is really very interesting to hear all of this from a white perspective. But thank you for all of your work. I didn't come prepared to make any kind of presentation, but I will, I shared with you some things about creation. So my daughter is Dr. Kelly Sherman Conroy. She's a native theologian. She has her PhD in systematic theology through Luther Seminary. You can find her just kellyshermanconroy.com, I think. And the work that she does in all of this. And then I have to make a correction. Tink Tinker is an ordained ELCA pastor, but he grew up like me. I grew up in my religion, my faith, both faiths, my native cultural faith and the Episcopal faith, and I'm a Lutheran pastor. And I'm just really a proud mom. My son is Sean Sherman. He's known as the SIOUX sous chef, and he owns a Wamley restaurant in Minneapolis. And Wamley received the award from James Beard for the best restaurant in the United States. and he does they do what they call decolonized food. So they serve only food that can, be harvested and foraged and that are natural to native communities around the United States. And he travels around and he teaches native communities how to do this again. And I'm just a mom.
Just a little.
that likes to talk, and I know you guys want to go to lunch, but when you allow a native person to stand up and talk, you just gotta sit there and listen. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not kidding, that's really true. But I'm also a survivor of boarding school, and after all these years, about a year ago, St. Paul Area Synod went together with a coalition for boarding schools, and myself and another woman, we told our stories. And after all those years, it was so traumatic, I'll never do it again, but other than to tell you that I'm a survivor of boarding school. On the Pine Ridge Reservation, though, the boarding schools that we had were a Red Cloud Indian School and another Catholic boarding school. And a lot of my little friends went to Red Cloud Indian School. There were horrific things that happened there to them. They'd get tied up to steel posts and they'd get whipped and just all kinds of things. Terrible things happened there also. So all of these boarding schools, whether they're government boarding schools or religious boarding schools, were horrible places for us because we became non-children. We really did. And they were just horrible places to be. But, and as far as creation, what I said in my sermon, if you're doing creation, caring for creation work or environment, always includes Indigenous voices because we are the voices that live this history. We are the voices that live and from our ancestry on through. And environment is a part of who we are. It's a part of if we're Indigenous people from around the world, environment creation is a part of who we are and why we are. So thank you. I've just really enjoyed my time with you. I'm sorry it's been so short. Oh, I'll give you a blessing before you eat lunch. Wakantaka, atea piki, na wonia wakan, uhinia unumai. May the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be with you always. Amen.
Amen.
But this is the informal portion. Q&A, conversation, that kind of thing. I don't know, maybe start with the question you actually had asked them about. So what is this farm?
Oh.
Right? You actually farm?
Is it a CSA or is it for your
So what's the farm is the question. It's not a CSA. We have done a CSA a few times, very small scale. We have gardens that we eat from and our many visitors eat from, and then we have some folks that we do sell to, and then we have some folks that we give away food to as well. So it's kind of a mix. But the goal of our farm isn't necessarily financial, like independence. We work part-time off the farm. We've done some different CSA models where people pay us for veggies and dairy products and stuff like that. But we do work part-time jobs.
Yeah. So and Eric said we eat from the garden. We also preserve a lot of food for the winter, and so we have meat and dairy and eggs, and preserved food. So we do eat, I'd say more than half of what we eat comes from what we've helped to raise on the farm. But, and then different seasons will, like this, for example, we live really close to Dubuque, Iowa, and we were made aware of a family of 10 who had been recently fled Afghanistan, who settled in Dubuque, and we asked if they would like to receive a box every week, and they were grateful because there was more food that they were used to. Otherwise, they're getting a lot of canned stuff from the food pantry and as they resettle. So it was kind of like a nice way for them to receive like a taste of home, like the milk with the cream separating on top and some homemade feta. Anyway, and it was a nice connection for us. We didn't speak the same language, but we we shared meals together, which is many, many times, and tea.
And along those lines, though, is it feasible to expand, or that's difficult to do when you work part-time? Or you don't want to be, it's the economy of scale, right? You don't want to get too big, so you can't keep on top of everything.
Right. The work that we do off the work that we do off the farm is part and parcel of our ministry as well. So I work with the Cincinnati Dominicans at Cincinnati Mound doing work for their retreat and conference center. Brenna's getting paid to do some of this Nuns and Nuns land justice work. And then we try to keep the land work to a scale where the 4 adults who live there can manage that. And we also welcome in people, and they can jump in on the work as well. But in case we don't have those extra people, we want to make sure that we're keeping it at a way that we can sustain this over the long haul and not ravage our bodies and all that stuff. So
I think we were sharing earlier, so Eric and I live with another married couple and their 2 children. So we've lived with the couple for about 12 years, and now the kids are 11 and 7. So we've been permanently in community together, and then we've had folks, some who've stayed with us for up to a year and a half, like exploring community living, and other folks who just come to visit for a couple days and everything in between. So we have a guest space for people who just need a place for a while, usually people who are exploring like what is it like to live in community and in like better relationship with land. We're pretty good at farming, but we're not experts. So we don't really consider ourselves like a training farm or something, but people can still learn a lot from us while they're there.
Who were your primary teachers?
The question was, who were our primary teachers of farming? So Eric and I both grew up on the East Coast. I'm from near Boston, and Eric's from Philadelphia, and we both got into the Catholic worker movement through the better known maybe aspect of the houses of hospitality. We both lived in houses of hospitality that shared our homes with folks who were more in crisis and needed a place to live. Otherwise, they wouldn't have one. And then it was really, for me, through that movement that I learned about this farming aspect. And, I would maybe travel out to a nearby farm and start learning. So I learned from a woman named Beth Ingham who ran Noonday Farm in Massachusetts. I would travel out there once a week, and I learned some methods from her. Eric had different backyard garden experiences in the city on the West Coast. And then when we moved into New Hope Catholic Worker Farm, which is south of Dubuque, there were folks who were already living there who they had a little more gardening experience than us. But honestly, early on, because we didn't have internet until 2 years ago, that was a commitment we had. But then with the pandemic, we're like, I think we finally need internet here if we want to still engage with the world. So we'd be out in the garden like with a book. And living in like rural Iowa or rural Wisconsin, we have neighbors who we can call. They might not agree with our politics, but they're really happy to help with telling us what to do if the cow is having trouble giving birth, or and they don't always. They kind of maybe are questioning of like some of our methods of how we like use mulch in our gardens. But anyway, I think they all respect that we're actually out on the land and not just in machines driving over the land. So our neighbors have been very helpful too. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Can you just say a little more about the Catholic worker movement?
I can say a few words about the Catholic worker movement, which is a movement founded in 1933 by Dorothy Day and Peter Morin. Dorothy Day was a convert to Catholicism. She's U.S. born. She grew up in Brooklyn, Chicago, and San Francisco, journalist, writer. Peter Morin was her colleague, 2 decades older, who is from the south of France, grew up on a farm where he said, our family's been living on the same piece of land since the days of St. Augustine, so roughly 1,500 acres, or 50 years. And they created a movement that started actually as a paper, the Catholic Worker newspaper, which continues to this day, a penny a copy. And people started showing up, needing soup, needing a place to stay. This is the height of the Depression in the 1930s. So the thought around the Catholic worker movement is sort of direct action in response to the crises of the day, and so people began getting inspired by their witness and saying, well, we can do this too. We can start a house of hospitality, or we can make some soup and serve. And from there, the movement's grown. There's 200 communities across the world, mostly in the United States and mostly in cities. Peter Morin always harbored a vision for rural communities living on the land. And he would say, we can't have a healthy culture without a proper regard for the soil. So the foundation is a healthy land, healthy soil. And he would say, eat what you raise and raise what you eat. And so people trying to build an alternative way of life on the land has always been a part of the Catholic worker movement's vision. There's maybe 20 Catholic worker farms across the world, and we're obviously one of those.
I have a question, totally different. One of the slides you had up here was the ELCA church statement.
Yes.
And it says, and I don't really understand it, so I want you to explain. The sale of the land is to go back to indigenous peoples. First of all, who's selling the land? Are they, what?
Do you want to talk in, or?
I'll share the little I know.
Is it?
So yeah, and also trying to repeat the question for the mic or the video as well. The question is, what is the ELC statement around reparations? Who is selling the land? And maybe offering some more details about that. Because Anne and I were just talking.
So that was a memorial at the last assembly, which was in August of this year. And perhaps some of you who know more about distinction between a memorial and a resolution could offer some additional guidance here. My understanding of a memorial, these can come up from various synods. We'd like to raise up this issue. And then the assembly will vote as to whether the entire assembly wants to memorialize what's in the memorial. My understanding is that it's non-binding at this point as a memorial. But what it's referring to is, and I think it's your question about, well, who is selling?
Yeah.
I think it's that list of ELCA entities. Congregations, synods, ministries, colleges, campus ministries, seminaries, camps, etc. That when it comes time for them to sell property,
Like if there was, say, what we call a Bible camp that we went
Correct.
to as kids. If that camp was closing and they needed to sell the land, then the intent would be, hopefully, that maybe the sellers would want to give the land back to the whole chunk.
or wherever
Whomever.
right, yeah.
Whomever, whatever the tribe was.
That's my
at the time.
understanding. And
And you said this statement was approved. It was
approved.
Yeah.
And can I just, I'm going to hand it to, just to follow up on, to first consult with the indigenous nation and say, like, would you like this returned? And just part of the work we do with the Land Justice Project is there's different ways to do that, because sometimes you need money for the return and can't just give it back. For them to be like the principal dialogue, for Native nations to be the principal dialogue partners first, and see, like, can we make a deal with you first and help you raise funds maybe to get this land back? There's multiple ways. It doesn't always have to mean, I don't know about with the Lutheran Church, but in our experience, it doesn't always have to mean just a donation of large amounts of land. It can be, but as long as the Native nations are first consulted and saying, would you like this back? And if so, how can we help make that happen? And I want to.
I just wanted to say there's a good article in the current Living Lutheran, the ELCA magazine, that addresses that question. And I think it was Western Minnesota or the Dakotas where there are a pretty substantial number of tiny congregations that are now going out of existence or merging together, and they have come to the point that they want to know what to do with their building or their land. And there's I believe it's a retired attorney who kind of has stepped in and taken interest in this and is helping congregations dispose of their land in whatever way they choose to. And sometimes it's giving it to another more active congregation of one denomination or another, and sometimes it's repurposing it or returning it, as you were talking to. But it's in the current issue of Living Lutheran, I think, and I just read it shortly, so not long ago, that's why I remember it.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah.
Well, and one of the reasons it says that encourage, it's because as a Lutheran church, we are congregation-based. We're not driven from the top down, we're driven by the congregation. And we have voluntarily joined together to do things. And so it's not like there's some committee somewhere who's going to say, you have to do this, this is your process. So it's an encouragement to the congregation, hey, look at this. What works for you? This is a good idea. Look at it. So it's kind of that, it's kind of like, okay, well, what do we do as a congregation? We're dissolving, we have extra whatever. So the ELCA says, hey, we think this is a good idea. The whole, the group that was there thinks it's a really good idea, so look at it. It's kind of what, and then pray on it.
And each congregation is allowed to make their own decision.
Correct, yeah.
I was wondering if either Ann or Wilda might want to talk a little about what our neighbors at First Methodist have done recently.
Okay.
Would you like to?
You mentioned
Yeah.
St. Dunstan's and their voluntary tax
Yes.
to the Ho-Chunk, and First Methodist has done something interesting
Yes.
Oh,
recently.
hey.
First United
I'm
Methodist
intrigued.
Church, kitty corner across the street from us, has had a 2-year process for the last 2 years, trying to determine how they wanted to go about doing a land acknowledgement. I mean, they, like us, and everybody else in this area, sits on Ho-Chunk land. And so they went about it in a very deliberate way in which they engaged people in their own community, people throughout the wider Madison community, the Ho-Chunk leadership, the leadership of other indigenous nations, the leadership of the city of Madison, starting with the mayor and a couple of rungs down from that, and Dr. Daniels, the president of Madison College. And the committee, they don't have the Methodist Church does not have a foundation as Bethel does to help with these sticky little financial matters. But the committee that was in charge of this came up with $10,000. They didn't explain how they did that, but they challenged the congregation to come up with another $10,000. And with that $20,000, they have endowed a scholarship that for at least one indigenous person every year ongoing will get funding, scholarship to Madison College. So for them, it was a question of not just words of land acknowledgement, but also deeds. And they put up a new cornerstone for their church right at the intersection of Wisconsin Avenue and Dayton Avenue, on a small boulder with a plaque that contains on it the specific words that say this land was Ho-Chunk land. And that's inscribed inside of an outline of the state of Wisconsin, and it has an eagle on top. I memean, this is part of the Ho-Chunk flag, I think. An eagle on top and a peace pipe. And I couldn't quite tell what the third item down was. It might have been an oar or a paddle sitting on top of the bear, the Bear Clan. So it was very meaningful. And at the ceremony, they had all kinds of dignitaries. The mayor of Madison spoke, the president of Madison College spoke. They had the Ho-Chunk drum group from come on, help me. No, Wisconsin Dells, thank you.
I knew it was up north somewhere.
And also, the leader of that group was sang and spoke. And then it had a long half-hour prelude to the ceremony itself where it was all drumming. And then the clan mother spoke. And I can't list all the people. President of the Ho-Chunk Nation who lives in Black River Falls, I think. And so they put a lot of effort into this. They put a lot of thought into doing this respectfully. And just as they were starting the formal ceremonies for all things, for all of this, down the aisle came this elderly woman, 93-year-old Ada Deer. And most of the indigenous people were seated at the front of the church. So when she got within distance where someone spotted her, the whole front of the church stood up, with great respect. She didn't speak, but she certainly was well acknowledged that day. Wow. Then we went outside after all of the speeches and prayers and stuff, and they did the formal in whatever the word is, investiture of laying the new cornerstone. Then we came back inside for a very nice reception where the food was, an acknowledgement to indigenous people. There was corn soup and there was rice, wild rice in the meatballs, and there was apple cider, and there was, a very nice dessert, I'll have you know, with cranberries and cherries and nuts that I would like to put some in my pocket, but I was just polite not doing that. But anyway, I sat at the table, at the reception table that day with John Stolzenberg, who is the head of their green team. And he was very pleased to note that at our same table was a group from the Congregational Church, Episcopal Church, someone from UCC, and someone else whose identity I either don't know or didn't remember. But it was an indication of how many people had become aware of what they were doing and were interested. And John said to me, maybe you'll learn something today. Maybe you will find something that Bethel would find worth duplicating here. So I was really glad I went.
Yeah, thank you so much. What?
Do you want to get them?
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that story. It's really important to kind of get the details on some of these just sort of grassroots initiatives. Yep.
Much more important than just saying at the beginning of your meeting that this was indigenous land, or, put a little paper plaque up someplace in your church.
Right, exactly. Yep.
Deeds as well as words. Right.
Given what you have learned or know, can you comment a little bit about the whole idea that this was land for the Europeans to occupy and quote own in the first place? I mean, it was like it was there for the taking. I mean, even France sold to Louisiana Purchase. I mean, all that is contrary to the whole notion that this land was somebody else's to begin with.
Right. Yeah. So the question is about how the process of taking the land and, what the foundational documents for the colonization process here are in what is now called the Doctrine of Discovery. And that was a series of papal bulls from the 15th century that the popes were writing. If you encounter, as explorers, if you encounter peoples who are not Christian, they have no right to that land. It is terra nullius. It is blank land, open land. And so we should have mentioned this earlier, because that as Catholics, as Christians, that's a really key foundation for a lot of really, really bad stuff that we have inherited, and so that's why we need to work as repairers, because we just organized the Quad Cities Native Lands Tour down in Rock Island area where Black Hawk was, and in the 1820s, as settlers were coming to this region, the Sauk people would return from their winter hunting grounds, and there were white people literally living in their lodges, had moved in while they were away, with this sense that, well, we're entitled to this land because there were treaties. They were fraudulent treaties. In 1804, 5 million acres was signed over by a drunk Sauk man who had no authority to sign over the land. 5 million acres, and so the U.S. government used these fraudulent means to get indigenous peoples who were very vulnerable to sign treaties, or sometimes just to move in. And I actually, this maybe leads in a little bit, it's sort of a tangent, but I wanted to, Brenna and I were really struck by the choir singing the Many and Great song. We had never heard that sung by a choir. Beautiful, thank you, that was really profound. But in Minnesota, that's where the settlers were moving into rural Minnesota on Dakota land, and the Dakota were getting squeezed and squeezed and squeezed, and then they were starving. And so they rebelled and declared war on the U.S. government, the Dakota-U.S. War of 1862. And eventually, around 300 Dakota warriors were imprisoned, sentenced to death. And Abraham Lincoln said, we can't execute 300. You have to get that number down. And so they got it down to 38. And Abraham Lincoln signed the death orders for 38 Dakota men, 37 of whom were baptized Episcopalians. And right before they were executed, on December 26, 1862, right before they were executed in what was then and remains the largest mass execution in U.S. history, they sang that song, Many and Great, which had been written with a missionary. We had assumed that it was an ancient Dakota song, but that was a Christian hymn that those people had written together with the missionary. 37 of them were Episcopalians. And there's a very, very powerful documentary called Dakota 38 that is free online, and they sing that song, and it's a very, very powerful moment. So that was very, very poignant to hear that song sung today.
And I just wanted to add on the doctrine of discovery. So the Catholic Church wrote these papal bulls. The Pope wrote these bulls. And then, in 1823, the U.S. Supreme Court relied on those papal documents in a case, Johnson versus McIntosh, I believe, in 1823. And so it's codified now into U.S. law. And as recently as 2005, Ruth Bader Ginsburg then cited that 1823 ruling, which was based on the papal, so much for separation of church and state, but in a ruling against the Oneida people. So even though the U.S. recognized, yes, we stole your land illegally, but according to this 1493 document written by Pope so-and-so in 2005, Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, nope, you don't get your land back.
Alexander VI.
Alexander VI.
Otherwise known as Rodrigo Borgia. A name that has a certain cachet.
Yeah. Okay. Just sort of
that went over
Italian mafia.
Well, some people consider him the most corrupt pope in history.
Okay.
And, poisoner and all of these. Much of which is probably fictional, but not an upstanding.
And many Christian churches, I'm assuming, including the ELCA, I hope, not the Catholic Church, have publicly renounced the doctrine of discovery, which is, I'd say, a huge thumbs up. It's great. And now, like, it's great to, like, burn a paper and say, we don't believe in this thing anymore. So what does that actually mean? If it doesn't, I've heard, like, Native people say, and I would agree, if it's not coming back with a return of all the things we stole, it's easy to make an apology to feel better about ourselves, but then we need to do something about it. Yeah, thanks.
As a footnote, I've read somewhere that for an indigenous, the idea of owning property was a foreign concept. I mean, how can you own property?
Yeah.
So they were,
comment was like,
sell your own land, so selling
how
it.
could you even own land? So yeah, the treaties were, I think, took advantage of a different understanding of the concept of property ownership. It was sort of like, sure, we can share this, just like maybe you and I would say, sure, we can breathe the same air at the same time. Now, it doesn't mean I'm signing over my rights to ever breathe air again. It's it's a different concept, but now the way Indigenous folks, if they want to still survive and practice their, just survive as a people and maintain their connection to land, the way a lot of them are doing it is they're like, okay, you're telling us we have to own land, then we're going to buy it. We're going to buy it back from you, or you're going to give it back to us, and we're going to own it so that you can't take it away again in your system. So, yeah.
Also, I just wanted to say, from my understanding, and this may not be exactly correct, but my understanding is that Indigenous peoples didn't have a sense of private property, but they had a sense of their territory, and that there was an asking of permission to go into another nation's territory and to acknowledge whose territory you're on. So it was a sort of a sense of common belonging to a certain piece of land. And we've taken a lot of groups out to Effigy Mounds National Monument, which is a really special place. And one of the workers there says, in my relationships with Native peoples, they talk about the land doesn't belong to us, we belong to the land. And that's that sense of belonging that I think is really important.
And just, to add on to that, I think it was this was a real sticking point for the U.S. government. They knew, like, they don't have a concept of ownership. We need to figure out how to get that work, because it looks bad to all the liberals on the East Coast that we keep killing Native people in the West. This is very broad strokes, generalization, but kind of true. So in 1887, they passed the Dawes Act, otherwise known as the Allotment Act, which also was around the same time that boarding schools were created. And boarding schools were a deliberate policy to indoctrinate Native children into the white concept of how to own property. So that was like a definite, like, once they become white, even though we won't treat them as white and we'll still be racist against them, they won't have a sense of common ownership anymore. So boarding schools were definitely directly tied to the attempt to steal land. And then also the Allotment Act divided up reservations so that each Native family would get, I think it was like 40 acres or something, I forget exactly. They each got an allotment, maybe it was 160. Anyway, they each got an allotment, and they said, you can own this and become capitalists like us. You can own your own land. You can't hold it communally anymore. And I don't remember the percentage, but many people create that Allotment Act to the bleeding of the most Indigenous land at once, because once they got this grace period of not having to pay taxes on it, which was such a foreign concept, like, I have to pay to keep this land. So many of them lost the land they held title to, or sold it because they were starving and needed money, or had gone to boarding school and decided I will be a capitalist, and so sold the land, and that's how a lot of land got lost, was the Allotment Act. That's why a lot of white folks have second homes on what are now reservations, vacation homes. A lot of the best spots on reservations still white people own and vacation there because they're beautiful, and they got them often because of the Allotment Act. So it was a very deliberate policy to break Native people of this communal sense of ownership, and that was stopped in the 1930s when the government and people started realizing how harmful this policy was. It stopped, but the damage had already been done. And then back.
And there was just one line, one chilling line in the 1880s from a white director of Indigenous Affairs saying, we need to get them from saying we to I. That was like the explicit goal.
I was going to point out since you mentioned that the doctrine of discovery was based, at least primarily, on documents from popes. And here we are approaching Thanksgiving, when in our national mythology we have these lovely images of happy pilgrims and Indians sharing a feast, that those Calvinist pilgrims who came with the idea that still infects our national mythology of America as the new Israel, driving out the Canaanites, the indigenous people, and with God's blessing to do so.
Yep. And Brenna grew up right next to Plymouth.
America's hometown. That's where I grew up.
Yeah. I think there's an interesting thing in Wisconsin, and that's, depending on how we want to look at it, Menominee Nation, Menominee County, or Menominee Reservation, all one and the same. I believe it's still 90% tribal-owned land, the last time I read. So and I think that's a huge thing.
Yeah, the Menominee, their ongoing resistance to allotment and all these processes, and you're going to be showing a film soon called Inhabitants about their amazing sustainable forestry management, where people come from all over the world to see how they're managing their land there. What I hear a lot of indigenous people say is, we are still here, and we have continually resisted this onslaught of oppression, and it is amazing. And they have a lot of key ways that we as white settlers need to learn in this time of eco-crisis, without romanticizing, too.
Yeah, Eric just mentioned the Menominee resistance. I think it was to termination in the 1950s when the United States decided to say, we're not doing this reservation thing anymore. You're all on your own. And that was also a really devastating policy for so many Native nations, but the Menominee really headed up the resistance nationwide to that, and so that got overturned as well. So they still maintain their sovereign status, though I've been hearing that that's depending on what the U.S. Supreme Court decides with the ICWA law, the Indian Child Welfare Act, the Supreme Court, that's in question. So many Native children were being adopted out. I think at some points it was like 75% of Native children were being adopted out to white families and other, maybe by like nice white people who didn't realize what was the result, but really these Native children were not growing up knowing their Native ways. So ICWA was instituted to say that first the tribal nation needs to be consulted and they need to give permission to adopt a child out, and in most cases they say no, we'll find somebody Native to adopt this child. But that's now in question. I think they just finished hearing arguments about that. And the question is it a racist law to say to white people, you can't adopt somebody who's Native? Is that racist against white people? Or is it a sovereign nation law, which would be a very different scenario? You can't just take children from another nation because that's an act of genocide. So the Supreme Court's going to be letting us know next June, and that I think is going to have a huge impact on whether nations can, on lots of areas of their sovereignty and their ability to make decisions as sovereign nations.
And isn't the issue of the best interest of the child also part of that decision?
Oh, sure.
And then, of course, who determines the child's best interest,
Yeah, the best interest of the child. And 100%, I'm sure there are going to be cases where it might be better for them to stay with their white foster parents, but I think the law, anyway, I would say the law needs to stand that we can't.
The tribal community should have the first chance to do that, and if they're like, we don't have the capacity, then.
With you on that. It's just the whole concept of who determines the child's best interest. Is it just their material well-being? Is it the relationships they have with people? that determine the best interest for the child.
It's a very patronizing thing to say, you as a tribal nation can't decide what's best for this child. We, the United States government, we know what's best because we're more adults, or I don't know why they would.
Or the white majority.
The white majority.
Along those lines, I guess, I wanted to say, what's new down the pipeline, but that's kind of, what's the next thing that the Catholic workers may protest, or what's coming up with pipelines or dams, or what's happening? What issues have you identified in the future that your group may want to protest? Anything we need to know?
Yeah, the question, and I'm repeating a lot of what you say, not to be patronizing, but for the people on camera to pick up, just so you know. So what's new, what's coming for Catholic workers? And maybe Eric can talk about, it's actually not a pipeline, but there's a group in Madison related to the Catholic worker who's really concerned about the F-35 fighter jets coming. And so I think in March there's going to be a resistance gathering here. Do you want to say any more about that?
Here in Madison and maybe here at Bethel, right, Ann? Just that in terms of just broad brushstrokes, that F-35s are now a concern for a lot of folks in Madison, including the few Catholic workers that are in Madison. I was wondering if you wanted to talk about Line 5 at all.
Sure, I don't know a ton about it.
We don't know a ton about it, but, or if anyone does.
Line 5, which is also run by Enbridge Energy. A few years ago, Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, said, we're not renewing your contract. You can no longer send tar sands oil through the pipeline in Michigan. And Enbridge said, watch us. So they're still doing it.
Is that the pipeline that goes under the Straits of Mackinac?
That must
Probably.
Yeah.
You might know more than I. It might go under the Straits of Mackinac. Yeah. So a lot of the people who were up at the resistance camps in northern Minnesota. Once that battle was sort of, at least for now, they're still fighting it in courts on tribal sovereignty law, but that's just going to take many years. And they think that they have a really good chance of winning because treaties are actually the supreme law of the land, as it says in the Constitution. But the damage from the pipeline digging has already been done. So a lot of them turn their attention to the struggle up in Michigan. But I came home and turned my attention to our farm. So I don't know a ton of what's happening there. But.
Do you know, Todd? Or?
Just that it's ongoing, and the now re-elected governor and attorney general, I'm sure, will be. And now that they have a Democratic legislature, we'll probably be working really hard on that. Mm-hmm. There's, of course, a lot of bad feeling in Michigan toward Enbridge because one of the worst oil spills ever was in the Kalamazoo River. About, 12 years ago, something like that. I think it was just about the time we moved away from Michigan. And that's left a really bad feeling with many people. So Enbridge is not a very good actor as a corporate entity in terms of their responsibility.
Yeah, it was very, because the trial for Brenna's Line 3 action took place in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, which I believe is the largest Enbridge spill.
Inland spill. In U.S. history.
In U.S. history is right there as well. So yeah, there's a lot of ill feeling towards Enbridge, and 94% of Minnesotans did not want to have that line come through. And shows you who's in charge.
Well, money talks.
Yep.
I don't know if this is still the right term, but is the Bureau of Indian Affairs, whatever it's called now, is it a better actor these days, a better character, or not? Is it still doing bad things?
The question is about the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and I don't know much about them. I don't usually hear them talked about in a positive light, but I don't hear them talked about much in general. So
but do they have any jurisdiction over these issues of land ownership?
Sure.
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. That's a good question.
I remember reading David Troyer's book on the native history of the United States, and him saying the BIA, or as some natives call it, bossing Indians around. But I don't know if they're Todd, do you want to say?
Well, I was just going to point out that the current director of, Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, is Native American. New Mexico, I believe.
Pueblo, yeah.
And BIA is under Interior, I think.
Oh, okay.
So at least directionally, there may be some movement toward improving things, but of course, those jobs change over time.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, we just don't. We don't know enough.
But we've heard great things about Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland. I think she's
She's been very active in the issues surrounding the boarding schools.
Yes. And also, we just met a Potawatomi woman who was named to a commission, maybe Reconciliation in Place, where they're trying to identify all of the racist names of towns and rivers and landmarks, and got to try to get them all changed.
And sports teams.
Yeah.
Yeah, Julie Dye is her name, part of the commission. And one of the first tasks is to change anything in the United States that starts with the word squaw, because that's a racist term. And so they're changing that. But then I'm trying to identify other racist names and changing those, rivers or streets or anything federal. And I just wanted to say another word about respect of Native people, and try not to I'm not really holding a lot of guilt, but maybe some regret that we had Pastor Joanne with us. And driving up here, I said to Eric, I should have brought tobacco. It's I don't know if it's every Native nation, probably not, but in many Native nations, and I'm assuming Lakota is for sure one, when asking them to speak or do any sort of favor for you, it's even before the offer of money in exchange of tobacco, offering that person tobacco is very respectful. And different nations will receive it in a different way, whether it's just a package of tobacco or a certain tobacco tie, or just, I think the Ho-Chunk maybe just take straight, like dried tobacco, because it's a sacred plant. It's used in many ceremonies, and it's an offering that you give back to the earth. It's very much tied into the idea of reciprocity. I don't want to speak too much on the sacredness of tobacco, because I don't know. I'm not Native. I don't know a lot, but I'm feeling regretful that we did not offer that to her, and feeling regretful that we didn't cede over the last, either the first or last 20 minutes of our talk. It's like hindsight, right? But I just wanted to say that we made that mistake, and maybe in the future we will try not to make that mistake. But I wanted to share with you some of my regret, just so that would have been, I think, a more respectful way for us to go about things, and we missed the ball on that. So apologize to you, and maybe we'll be in touch with her later.
You send her some. I mean,
Yeah,
that's what we do. FedEx or some,
So it sounds like you know about this practice. And
well, I've heard, yes, I've
great.
heard of it. And that's sweet that you brought that up.
Yeah. Just wanting to try to model what, even if we didn't model it, I'm trying to make up for not modeling it by telling you what we didn't model well.
Well, that probably should have come from Bethel, because the invitation to her wasn't from you, it was from Bethel. But that's something for us to learn.
Yeah, all of us can be learning together.
Yeah,
it's good things for us to be learning in this together.
I don't know that any of us thought of it.
Including us.
And I should have. I just finished reading The Walleye War, book about the struggles about 40 years ago, and there were lots of instances in there where tobacco was offered in the Ojibwe activities. And
yeah, and that's what we've been trained by an Ojibwe elder, Mary Ellen Baker, who's taught us to, put it in a red fabric pouch and, hand with your left hand. And I had invited a Ho-Chunk elder to Sinsinawa Mound, and I was all proud to have the tobacco ready to go to hand to him. And he just looked at it and he said, well, no, the Ho-Chunk take the tobacco just straight. So there are different ways of doing that, but so I had to, take it out, and that's what, it's an important, because when I asked that Ho-Chunk elder, how much do you charge to come and speak? And he said, well, you can't afford me. And I was like, okay. What if I offered you tobacco? He said, now you're speaking my language. And so that, it's not all Native people, but for certain Native folks that's an important offer of respect. And so we learned that from other folks, so we want to just continue to pass that on to you folks as you engage in this work, that tobacco is an important piece of it. And our friend Mary Ellen Baker has given us some tobacco seed, and so we had one tobacco plant growing on the farm this year and dried that, and we'll offer that. And so
Yeah, maybe we can send some.
So like a tobacco leaf is the gift, or how much?
You want not a pack of Camels, I mean.
Yeah, so
it could be,
Mary
but
Ellen,
it's probably not. But like the loose leaf.
the loose leaf we usually
all
usually
natural.
buy. Try not to buy the stuff labeled Red Man, but there's other loose leaf you can buy. That's a pretty popular one. And yeah, I don't want to advise you.
As it's a symbol. So
People will take it seriously and use it to
very
pray.
serious.
So it's more than a symbol. It's like maybe for the Catholics and maybe for Lutherans, I don't want to say it's the same thing as Eucharist, but like it's
on that level.
It's on that level of seriousnit's. So
it's
pretty
a prayer,
important.
really, I think.
Yeah, and Mary Ellen would say can't do it without wrapping it up in a little red piece, cotton cloth, and then Michigan is like, I'll take the whole pack because I need it for prayer. Anyway, and then I've read books where if you don't have anything else, at least giving a cigarette, which is not ideal, but at least they can unravel the cigarette and use that. But I think that would be only in an emergency.
You were going to say something?
I think it's interesting when we talk about Native Americans. We tend to think of them as the Native Americans. And I grew up in school with Menominee, Oneida, and Stockbridge. Well, not Mohican, they're back to using Mohican now. And then I work with the Choctaw. It's really fun. These are very different people. I'm Irish Protestant, my wife is Irish Catholic, so we're very different just in that way. But I mean, it's not, you can't make the assumption, like you can with any people, I know that because I know this Menominee. Well,
right. Then
you find out the difference in everybody, and it's a really a neat community that's communities. And so many things to learn about because they are communities. And so to nail them down to one group of, like they're one group of people is just not true.
Yeah. 574 federally recognized different nations in the U.S., and I'm sure countless more. But there's the white people often say we are a nation of immigrants, and some indigenous people will say, well, no, like a nation of immigrants would have come and adapted to the culture here, and so that's like trying to, Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about the invitation to be not indigenous but naturalized to this place, and to learn the specific protocols of each nation around tobacco, for instance.
In France, you maybe kiss on the cheeks, but here, we never learned, what's appropriate here. And we've found, it's not across the board, but it's generally well received to say, is it appropriate for me to offer you tobacco? How would you like that? Generally, that's pretty well received. You might meet a grumpy person who is like, that's the millionth time someone's asked me, and they might not be excited about that question. But in general, we've had really great responses when we just ask. But we forgot this time. Okay, and we're getting the wrap up. Finger.
Thank you so much.